Good evening, everybody. If you just wanted to take a seat, we're going to start. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I begin by paying my respects to the traditional owners of this land, the Bunurong people, and their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also pay my respects to our Holocaust survivors, our founders, for without their dedication, foresight, and courage, we would not have this world-class museum today. My name is Aviva Weinberg, and I am the head of Engagement and Philanthropy here at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. As I look around the room, there are many familiar faces in the crowd who are loyal supporters of our Holocaust Museum, and others who have stepped inside our doors for the first time. As custodians of memory, we all share the responsibility to pass on our Holocaust history and learnings for future generations. Tonight we are fortunate to be hearing from a panel of thought leaders on how we can safely do this. Moderated by Dr. Simon Holloway, our panellists' combined expertise will help us unpack how to talk about the Holocaust with children who will carry forward our survivors' legacy. Morris Gleitzman is a best-selling Australian children's author. His books explore serious and sometimes confronting subjects in humorous and unexpected ways. Among his famous titles is his Holocaust-themed series Once, which many of you may be familiar with. Dr. Shalya Hirschson is a psychologist who runs her own private practice in Melbourne. She holds a doctorate and a master's degree in educational psychology and provides counselling and assessment to children, adolescents and adults. Shalya's special fields of interest include parenting support, social skills, childhood trauma, depression and anxiety, amongst others. Lisa Phillips has extensive experience as a history teacher and as a head of department in Victorian schools. She holds a master's in education and has a special interest in designing meaningful and effective learning experiences. Lisa was head of education at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum and is currently the pedagogy specialist. In 2020, Lisa was the co-chair of a working group creating Holocaust curriculum for years 9 to 10 in Victorian government secondary schools. Please join me in welcoming our panellists to the stage.
Thank you very much, Aviva, for that very warm introduction. I want to thank everybody for coming this evening. And actually, before I address some questions to the panellists, I'd actually like to start off by making an additional acknowledgement which relates to the events of October 7. And I've no doubt that many of us, if not most of us, if not indeed all of us, are thoroughly preoccupied at the moment, not only about those events, and about our concern for the safety of our loved ones who are overseas, but also with our anxiety for the ensuing conflict and for the repercussions of that conflict on social media and on the streets of Melbourne. Many of us have children who are very interested in knowing precisely what is going on. Myself, I have a 7-year-old who, while she doesn't know what's transpiring, she does want to know when she sees all of these posters down the street, what does kidnapped mean? And so the question that I would actually like to start off by asking you, Shalya, is if you have any general advice as regards how one might broach a traumatic subject with young children.
Hi, everybody. Is it working? There. Welcome. Thank you so much for attending. That's a really good question, Simon. I think in terms of broaching the subject with kids of all ages, I like to believe that parents are their own experts on their own children. So trust your gut in terms of how you know your child might respond to news that they are hearing, and follow your gut instinct with that. We know that children, because of social media and technology, we know that children are going to be exposed to all sorts of things, and that might be in the park, it might be on TV, it might be through social media. But one of the things that we're experiencing in the schools, and we're seeing a lot of this, I'm certainly seeing it in my practice, is that even if we do have a lot of supervision going on with parents, where we might be stopping children from looking at the news or sharing videos or pictures or images through social media, one of the things that we cannot actually censor, that we don't have control over, is the talking about it. And this is happening in the classrooms, it's happening at playtime, and it really is quite a big problem because you can't shush people. You can't mute them, and you can't tell them to stop talking about it. So what do we actually do about that? And the message that I'd like to leave you with tonight is to really guide your children and guide yourselves in terms of reinstating a sense of safety. That's really where trauma comes from. When our sense of safety is shattered and undermined and pulled out from under us, and we can see from what's been happening over the last few weeks, it's happening to everybody, and it's happening widespread. So do as much as you can for my own children. I've got a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old. They don't have social media. We don't watch the news. We do talk about what's happening, that we have family and loved ones in Israel, and we talk about the war. My 9-year-old asked me, "Mommy, what's the war actually about?" And I said to him, well, it's a long story about the war, but basically, describing it in very simplistic terms, they're having a lot of difficulties figuring out how to share the land and who's going to live where and who's going to do what with the land. And they're still working on that, and they've been doing that for a very, very long time. So using very neutral words to talk to your children. Don't be scared of telling them the truth. There is a war. There's a lot of fighting. A lot of people are very sad. A lot of people are very scared. But we also talk to them in ways that reinstate their safety, that there's lots of people who are helping, there's lots of people who are protecting. Point that out to them in South Africa. Interesting that I said that, isn't it? That's part of all the trauma work that we do. You can hear from my accent. It comes with me wherever I go. South Africa, Australia, and everywhere in the world, that we're going to be exposed to things that are very difficult to understand. The difficulty is that once we see things and once we hear them, we can't unsee them and we can't unhear them. And with children and even with ourselves, I've got a lot of colleagues that I've talked to, and we seem to think that by looking at more of it and reading it and knowing more, we feel like we're going to understand it more and we can process it and digest it. And the problem is that doesn't actually work. Why? Because what's happening sits outside the realm of normality. The things that we are seeing, that we are being confronted with, sit outside the norm of what makes sense to us in terms of the horrors and the trauma. So with your children, yes, shield them from it. You can talk to them in very simplistic terms about it. But if you are not comfortable with them having a conversation or being exposed to pictures and images and things like that, use the same judgment that you would with any kind of technology or with videos and movies. Is that helpful?
Thank you very much, Shalya. And I think this really dovetails very much with what we're going to be focusing on this evening in terms of things being beyond the realm of normal. And of course, here at the museum, we're regularly speaking to school-age students about the Holocaust. And Lisa, as Aviva mentioned at the start, not only are you somebody who speaks to students, not only, in fact, are you somebody who has developed many of the programs that we deliver here in the museum, but you're also somebody who gives expert pedagogical advice to teachers. I wonder if you might share with us some of the sort of advice that you would give to teachers about how to approach the Holocaust with school-age students.
All right. Well, the first piece of advice that I give teachers is that we need to take, using Yad Vashem's pedagogy of taking students safely in and safely out of the Holocaust. Now, that is a pedagogy that's based on a number of different principles. But one of the first principles is that we've got to teach about who the Jews were before the war and the variety of ways Judaism was expressed throughout Europe, and not only the variety of ways it was expressed, but the richness of Jewish life and the normality of these people look just like you. If you look at any textbook on that's published in Victoria, and we did a good look at all of them that came across at the History Teachers Conference, they all start with the rise of Nazism. And what happens if you don't teach Jewish life before the war? You inadvertently reinforce Nazi stereotypes about Jewish life, and that's something that's been happening. So that's one piece of advice. We also need to teach the return to life and the resilience and rebuilding lives in Australia to make that link and connection that this isn't a topic that belongs somewhere else. It's our history here in Australia, in Victoria, with the Holocaust survivors who've built our community. I also teach them another piece of important advice is we focus in on individuals, and we don't just focus on the terrible conditions. We look at how people responded. The education is not what, I suppose, the cruelty and the depravity of the Nazis. The education is people's response to those conditions. What do you do when you've got your identity and you've taken away and you've been dehumanised, and how you care for each other within the camp system? So we look at items like that and telling the story. So it's how do you take this traumatising history and not traumatise your students? That doesn't mean that we don't not talk about death, but we do it in a way that we're always looking at the message and that it's educational. So we want to also understand not the depravity of the Nazi Party, but we want to understand how the Holocaust was humanly possible. And so we also focus in on choices, and that will bring me perhaps a little bit later on to our learning framework, but maybe I'll talk about that a bit later on.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Lisa. In fact, you've actually made a lot of points that I'd really like to draw out for the purpose of this discussion. But just before I do, I would actually just like to note that it's quite remarkable when students do come here to the museum and we ask them, what have they read, what have they engaged with? It's astonishing the number of kids who say once or one of the books within the one series. Sometimes they've read several of these books, and it must be astonishing for you to know how many people are engaging, Morris, with the books that you have written. And there's an enormous responsibility, I think, that must come with that for you as well. I wonder if you might like to share with us if there's anything that you particularly hope that all of these students who are reading your books are taking away with them.
Well, I hope that some of the very early decisions I made about how to approach writing about this whole area for young readers, I hope I made some right decisions, because yes, it is hugely gratifying to have one's book read by a lot of the sort of people that you wrote it for, but with the Once series in particular, what the books are about, and in particular the context and the time and the place where those stories are set, means that you do hope that more will happen than just the reading of the books. A very early decision I made was that there was no point in writing a story that, even though it would be doing nothing but attempting to represent truths, had so many truths that were so confronting, particularly for young people who didn't have any idea that such a thing could happen, that the people I was writing for wouldn't want to read the books. That's a self-evident dilemma. So I decided at the outset that because the story would be hugely informed by a large amount of the worst behaviour that our species is capable of, I thought that I would try, in a way that was credible and in no way diminishing, trivialising, or bringing saccharine to the exercise, to have at the heart of the story some very real, tangible examples of the best that our species is capable of. And that it's easy to say, yes, well, that balance is a good thing, but actually in life, and in particular in the times and in the huge number of human experiences that form the background to our discussion tonight, there is actually a tension between those two things. And I think there is a particular another level of the best that we're capable of is to find a way to keep alive in a context where the likelihood is that we will eventually lose it. Things like love and care for strangers, and just so this sort of tension. And of course, even as I'm saying that, I'm realizing that it's also just true of life, isn't it? We're all going to lose it in one sense, and so when we give of our best and we open ourselves as much as we can to love, intimacy, and parenting, and all the risks that go with that. So it's. I knew also that I was going to be writing these stories. Well, I thought it was just going to be one at the beginning. It was Felix who really steered me towards the later books, but who's the main character in the stories. But I knew that most of the young people who read once would not be from a Jewish family or a Jewish community, because my books are published quite widely and cross many social divides and etc. So those of you who've read once will have noticed, I'm sure, that it takes the form for the main character, and it's told in the third person. No, sorry, it's told in the first person, and that was actually an important part of what I thought would be best to introduce the world of this story to young readers, because doing it from the point of view of a young person who was very invested in not immediately accepting that because he hadn't seen his parents for 4 years, and because they'd hidden him in an orphanage 4 years earlier for reasons that he thought had nothing to do with what it really had to do with. He, in all sorts of ways that I know for some readers make him appear a little bit not very smart, because he's not, it's like wake up and smell the I wanted to allow readers to have the same journey of discovery that the central character's having. On the first page, he doesn't know there's a war. He doesn't know the Nazis, some years earlier, embarked on their terrible program, military and genocidal. And it's a slow journey of discovery when he runs away from the orphanage to try and find his parents. And I wanted to allow as much as possible young readers to discover for themselves what was going on, but by doing it through the eyes of a character who didn't want to admit to himself how terrible the things were. That gave me a kind of a way of controlling how slowly young readers it would slowly dawn on them.
I think it's very clear to see why your books have been quite as popular as they are, and how they do appeal to so many students who of that age are trying to engage with this subject. I wonder, and at this point I'd really like this to become a general conversation, so please feel free to jump in if you have other observations as well. But Shalya, I wonder, for those of us who have children who are studying books like this, how best can we support them? How best can we, as their parents, scaffold that experience for them so that they can learn about this without having a traumatic response?
It's a really good question, and I think it comes back to what I said before about knowing how much to protect our children and how much to expose them to. And I'm going to divert back to, or default back to, the guidelines that I'd like parents to use with anything relating to technology and information that is fed out there to our children. That I think we had a conversation a few moments ago about this, that I think it's becoming harder and harder to be parents, because I think that control is slipping away from us in terms of what our children are exposed to, and there's a lot out there. There's a lot out there that can be very damaging, that can be very traumatic for them and for adults to see. I think in the work that we've done over the last few weeks, we're seeing that adults are also completely traumatized by the information that they're seeing out there. So I think in terms of the guidelines, trust yourselves and trust what you know about your kids. I think that in terms of books, read the book before your child reads it, and see if there's anything in the book that you know will be very confronting or overwhelming for your child. The same as you should be doing with movies, the same as you should be doing with YouTube, with any of those things. I know it's easier said than done, but really keeping tight guidelines and a lot of supervision about what your children are being exposed to, because once it is seen and once it is heard, they cannot unsee and they cannot unhear what they have received, the information that they have received. It's really, really hard. I'm saying this as a parent myself. My own child, who's in year 6 now, she does not see what goes on social media. She has a phone, but she's not on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, no sending pictures or anything like that. But she told me, Mommy, when we're sitting in class, the children are talking about the things that they've seen, and I'm listening to it, and what must I do? And I said to her, you put your hand up and you ask the teacher if you can go and work in the library, because you can't keep people quiet. You can't ask them to stop talking about it, because our nature as human beings is to try to process and make sense of what we're hearing and what we're learning. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to process it and digest it and put it into a place. We think that we have a little scaffold, or we call it schemata, a little filing cabinet in our brain, where once we've talked about it and we've looked at the videos, we go, oh, that makes sense. I can now put it in that little place and it'll feel comfortable. But it never feels comfortable, because the nature of it sits beyond the realm of comfortable and anything that we know that's normal. I think so both Simon and Morris made a really good point. And Lisa, I'm sure, is going to elaborate on this about the pedagogy and the education, is that words and knowledge can be really empowering or disempowering for children. And that's why the stories are so important in terms of what they're reading. And I think it's beautiful in the way it's presented in the books, in that sometimes children do make up stories in their heads, and we do have these false beliefs that if we don't think about something, it's not happening, but that serves as a protective function. It's not always bad. And we know that children also engage in magical thinking. Well, if I just climb up the biggest mountain, or if I hide in the cupboard, Mommy and Daddy are going to come back for me, because they can't be gone. Which child wants to think about Mommy and Daddy being gone? And where have they gone to? So I think the words that we use when we talk to children, and the books that they select, and the videos and the movies that they watch, can be really empowering or disempowering for them. And that, I think I'm going to touch a little bit on trauma, if you don't mind, because I think it's relevant. And with reading the books, or any information that children do get specifically about the Holocaust or anything that happens in their life, we really want to be giving them the life skills to not get stuck in the stories. And that means that we do have to tell the stories of hope, and we do have to touch on people's thoughts and feelings, and be careful about the words that we use to describe the stories that we know that visit us in our lives. Trauma really happens when we become stuck and we become flooded or overwhelmed by the content of what we're seeing and what we're hearing. And it's very, very hard to digest that and process it and make sense of it. So whenever you're choosing a book for your child, ask them, are you interested in reading this? Do you know about it? You can talk in very, very benign, neutral kind of terms, that these are things that happen to Jewish people. It happens all over the world. Jewish people weren't liked by certain groups, or even with young children, and we'll touch on it in a little while. But it's never too soon to start introducing that to your kids, at the age of 3 or 4 even. It's important to be kind to people.
Shalya, I just want to press you on one point, though. It sounds like from what you've described about your daughter's response, she spoke very directly to you about how she was feeling. For children who are not speaking quite so directly, what does a trauma response look like? What are the sorts of things that we might just look for in children?
Okay. It's a tough question to answer very briefly, but I'm going to try my best, because it's a really good question, and a lot of people ask me this. Anything that sits out of the ordinary, that's out of character for your child. Trauma does present slightly differently in different age groups and at different developmental stages, but some of the main things that you might be seeing are changes in sleeping and eating habits, being more clingy for younger kids, being more tearful, being more emotional. Sometimes it comes out more as aggression rather than anxiety, withdrawal from activities that they previously found enjoyable, so not wanting to go play soccer or footy, not wanting to go to swimming lessons or ballet lessons, waking up in the middle of the night, nightmares, a lot more separation anxiety. For teens, it might be isolating themselves, not wanting to talk about it, so shutting themselves up from parents or from friends. And then you've got the more obvious ones, so asking you questions about it. That would be for older kids. Sometimes we see them becoming completely preoccupied, having to watch every news broadcast, wanting to read more stories. I'm seeing a lot of people nodding their heads, so it's obviously happening. But just being vigilant for anything that sits outside of the norm for your kids. You know how your kids behave, and I think for most parents, we can take one look at our child's face and know that something's up, that something's going on. And you can ask them, say to them, I wonder if you've been hearing anything about what's happening in Israel, or I wonder what you're thinking about the story that you heard in class. So, or reading a book, asking them the direct questions. They might say, I don't know, or I can't remember, but they might actually be able to tell you. So just looking for anything that sits outside the norm of their normal behaviour. If you're not sure and you're concerned, then ask a professional.
Thank you so much, Shalya. Just as a prelude really to the next question, some of the people in attendance this evening may have already had the opportunity to wander through our hidden museum. And this is a museum that is targeted at younger audiences from 10 and above. Elisa, having played such a direct role in the design of this museum, and Morris, I know that you had played a very strong role in many of the ideas, the decisions that were made with this museum. I'd actually like to ask if you might explain how does this museum go about presenting this subject without producing the sort of responses in students that Shalya has just described.
Oh, again, how am I going to do this quickly in a pithy way at this time of night? Okay, let me give it a go. So we were really lucky in many ways with the Hidden exhibition that it came out of a program called Hide and Seek Stories of Survival. And we knew from that program that the stories of hiding of our survivor community here in Melbourne really resonated with us, with students. I have to go back. The museum made a decision to create this program as a result of the Travelling Anne Frank exhibition, and as a result of that, we created our own program based on the hiding stories. When it came to actually deciding content and how we were going to put the museum together, Morris, you were involved early in the days when we contacted you, I think in 2016, and we sat around the table and we were almost going to convert this program into a museum. And we wanted it to call it Once, and we wanted Felix's voice. So if you have a look at my copy of Once, it's got all these tabs in it where we were pulling out quotes that we were going to use in the different spaces. But as we moved on, well, first of all, I'm going to take over from the panel for you, and just, Morris, you want to take us back to that early meeting we had together and your advice to us?
Well, when the museum first contacted me and said that they were doing a major rebuild, I guess, and reimagining of everything that's here, but that for the first time it would include a children's an installation specifically for kids, and the notion was that because a lot of the kids that you hoped would be a part of it would have read Once, that Once would become both a theme and it would the installation would contain some scenes from the book, and I was hugely honoured and flattered, but only for about a day, and then I started to think it just didn't feel quite right, because it took me years to be able to express it this simply. My hope from day one was that one of the things that Once would do would be to bring a lot of young people and their families to your front door here. And that's where I felt what you have here, which is the real voices, the real people, would take over. My author's note in the back of the book, in that very first edition, was, thank you for reading this book. Here's a couple of the reasons I wrote it, but I mostly wrote it hoping that you would want to now connect with the real voices. And I've had associations with a few places like this one, but nowhere quite like this one. And so this was exactly the sort of front door that I was thinking of.
So that was version 1, and that idea never went much further. And so when we look at what the hidden exhibition is actually doing, is we're taking 7 of our survivors who were active within the program, and we tell their stories. And within that, we're covering so many of the various themes and ideas. We're using our Safely In and Safely Out pedagogy, but we're also using our new learning framework that we have developed with the University of Melbourne's Centre of Wellbeing. And what we've done there is we have basically taken Holocaust knowledge, the key knowledge that we wanted students to have at this level, combined with well-being. And so we have a focus on positive psychology, and we look at different character traits like bravery, like hope, like kindness, perspective. I've got my cheat sheet here. Judgment, and what have I missed out? Fairness. And so throughout the exhibition, students are faced with this idea of choices, and looking not only at the choices, but the risk of these choices, but also the impact of these choices. And when talking with teachers who've come through the exhibition and teachers who've come through our professional learning program, one of the things they describe with students at the younger levels when they're very egocentric, they don't really understand the impact of their choices. And so this is something that we're trying to build in within the actual program and within the storytelling that we do within the museum.
Thank you. It's really marvellously done, and I really recommend to people to take an opportunity to have a look at this. Museum. I would at this point actually just like to point out that there's something of an unspoken assumption that we all share, and I think is shared really by everybody in the room, which is that there is an implicit value to the study of this subject. But I'd love to hear actually from the three of you, with your respective areas of expertise, what is actually the value to students engaging with this material in the first place?
So, people ask me, when should we start talking to our children about the Holocaust? At what age is it appropriate? And my answer is usually that it's never too early to start teaching and talking to children about kindness and tolerating others and tolerating differences. From the ages of 2 and 3, we teach them, and not only teaching them by talking to them, but modeling to them that we are kind to other people. I think apart from the whole technology issue that we have going on in society, I think we actually have a kindness issue. And this is something that I speak to parents about all the time. I'm seeing a lot of people nodding, so it's obviously resonating with you. We have a huge kindness issue, or a lack of kindness issue, that I see a lot of it in schools and in my practice as well. That we're not very tolerant of other people, and we're not very tolerant of differences. So modeling that to your kids, that instilling in them a sense of their identity and developing their self-concept as to who they are. And that links with what Lisa said in the beginning about knowing who we are as Jewish people and the story of Jewish people and what it means to be a Jewish person, regardless of how religious you are or where you are on that spectrum of believing and having spirituality. And that's not only to instill in them a sense of who they are in the world and in their family, and to live a life that's full of meaning and hope and purpose, but we also know from the research that people who have some sense of spirituality and some belief system, I probably shouldn't say this in front of Simon or any rabbis if they are here, but believing in anything, believing in fairies or in crystals or anything from the beginning, just believing in something, that there is a deeper purpose to who they are, but instilling in them that sense of Jewish identity, our belonging to a Jewish nation, to a Jewish family, the practices that we have. We know that people who have a belief system do better in life, that they're able to overcome adversity and trauma and difficult experiences. Why? Because they're able to tap into the meaning that they make of it. So I know I was being a little bit facetious about saying believe in fairies and crystals and things like that, but certainly it's our sense of who we are and our sense of belonging and our sense of community, and we could see how that is challenged all the time. Even now as we look around and we see what's happening in Israel, we see that people are pulling together. We're standing up for who we are. We're standing up for what we believe in, and it's so important for children to have that sense of belonging, and to do that from a very, very early age. I just want to touch briefly on what Lisa said with some of those fundamental values that they're teaching. And that is also that part of what we know from post-traumatic studies or post-traumatic growth is that we have to tap into hope and we have to tap into gratitude to show people that there is life and there is meaning and there is purpose in spite of all the horrors that we see. We know that people who have gratitude in their life also do better because they can make sense of, or they can make meaning out of what is happening to them. I know that also is easier said than done because there's a lot of things that are happening that don't make any sense to us. But modelling to children and giving them that life skill of finding hope, finding the goodness. We saw that also during COVID, that we saw there were doctors and researchers and community members who were doing so much good in the community, and that's so important for children to learn that even after all the terrible things that happened to us, as we could see with Morris's beautiful characters in his story, there is always that sense of what if we hope for something better? We don't let go of that. We can always find the goodness in every single situation, and modelling that to your kids is a wonderful life skill because in life they are going to go through adversity. They're going to have some really awful experiences, and we want them to be able to tap into the goodness and to rise above it.
Thank you, Shalya. I love that emphasis on resilience that comes with learning, with studying this history. I wonder if Lisa or Morris would also care to respond to that question. Why is the study of the Holocaust important for children?
Well, I'll just go back to the learning framework and the importance of giving students and children agency, that they have the capacity to make a difference, and it could be by practicing that skill of kindness, and that it does, what they do does have impact. Their decisions, their choice of words does have impact. But the other thing, just going back to your previous question, one of the things I work with teachers is looking at artefacts, and I actually do look at Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and I use the quote, when we're no longer able to change a situation, we're challenged to change ourselves. And so we look at artefacts from our collection that show the resilience of our survivors in the most terrible conditions, actually overcame adversity from whatever these artefacts and stories are telling through them. And it's a way of letting them, I suppose, teach the resilience. And we're also, for the broader community, we're dealing with a COVID generation of children who've been in the pandemic, been in the lockdowns. And I suppose, Shalya, you work with this all the time. What we're seeing is students who are in the groups that we're working with who are presenting 2 years behind their social emotional levels. And it's well established that we really don't know the impact of the pandemic. It's really important to really work with the students on their well-being and their resilience. I think that is the big buzzword in schools at the moment.
Maris, did you want to say something?
I would just like to throw in something that I've been thinking about a lot in recent years with my own work, and one, I think, very valuable reason for not trying to protect kids from the darker, from the worst end of our spectrum of possible behaviours, is that I think it's reasonable to say that the young people on whose behalf we're speaking here this evening, let's say that they're mostly school age, so in the next 20, perhaps 30 years, it's going to be their world. And I think it's reasonable to say that no human generation before them will be collectively facing a bigger suite of global problems that have the capacity to end the long life of our species. And because one of the things we've bequeathed them, as well as that situation, is a media-drenched life, a young life for them, where they will have all sorts of decontextualized glimpses and overhear things, and our news industry, for some very good reasons, does present us with a whole lot of decontextualized up-to-the-minute stuff. Young people have far more knowledge about the world than they have agency, and I speak with and listen to thousands of them each year, and I hear some of the tension and some of the anxiety that creates. But I have come to see stories. I think one of the reasons they've stayed with us for as long as we've been able to share them in our long human history is that they really are a tool as well as a culture and an entertainment. And young people's stories are actually quite simple in their shape and their purpose, and they are about problem solving. And they often acknowledge that there are some problems that won't be solved within the space of a story or within the lifetime of those characters, but they can still be about learning how to solve problems, how to think and feel about problems. And I think if we really want and expect, and we need our next generations of young people, the future adults, to go out and do better than we've done, I guess, and our forebears, because the problems, we've not been able to find a way to make those problems go away. I think it's the least we can do is equip them as best we can in our various ways as parents and teachers and counsellors and inspirers. They deserve to know the nature of the playing field, and the playing field has the best and the worst on it. To expect them to go out having been shielded from the worst at a time when they are still developing the agency that they will need to make a difference is really unfair. I have spent years examining my own conscience. Do I have the right to impose an aspiration like that with my work, but with all of our work, onto a terrible human experience that whose dominant characteristic for those caught up in it was not the luxury of being able to think about future generations so much as just struggling for survival for self and family. But I then think, would those people be offended by this notion that we are trying to take something we can't reverse, it's happened, and try and help use it in various ways to try and make it less likely that such things will happen in future, and also to help equip young people to solve problems that actually have no direct connection with that terrible time in history. And I've come to think, yes, that is justifiable, and so it's something that I talk a lot to other writers about, and I think I was the Children's Laureate for a couple of years just before COVID, and a project that I've brought with me from that, which went on the shelf for 2 years during COVID, but I've just revived it, is to try and, I'm working with a group of theatre people because so many, I think, of the skills that will be useful in this. We're trying to put together a kind of a workshop, a set of ideas and resources that we can make available to as many schools as want them. And it's just seeing a kind of a whole in the national curriculum, and I guess it's life skills, but it's actually, how do you think about things that make you uncomfortable to think about? How do you sit down with people who aren't members of your family and your chosen friends and wrestle with problems and possible strategies and solutions that you quickly come to realize are not going to allow you to dust your hands off after 6 months and say, we did it. You're simply starting a process that will be inherited. But I think it's very important, and stories for young people have got so many of these skills, and you ran through a list of them, and hidden is, although it's the incredibly transporting and deeply connecting use of a relatively few square meters of floor space. It's remarkable when you step back and realize what you've just had in terms of a revelatory and deeply empathetic and emotional experience in about twice the size of a large lounge room. But it's using so many of those story components in the way it's been structured and put together. I'm going on too long, but I just very quickly want to say, and this really goes back to your challenging but very necessary first question and statements. And perhaps, and I'm not a trained psychologist and I'm not a trained teacher, and maybe this is a perception that is slightly at odds with what my interpretation of a couple of things, not hugely at odds. One thing I have learned is that although subtext isn't officially in the national curriculum until about year 8, very young children see, hear, and perceive subtext in the stories, in the communications that we tell each other. And the fear, one of the biggest fears for young people is what's under the bed in the dark, is something that they know is being hidden from them. To see that adults are scared to talk to them about something is terrifying. And you've given some wonderful examples of how it is possible to talk in simple, non-inflammatory sort of language, and to start those conversations. I've spoken to thousands of parents and teachers whose young people have read Once and books like that. And my simple message is the conversation is more important than the book. The book is just there to start the conversation. But the conversation, it doesn't have to be sophisticated, it doesn't have to be an overload of truths, but it must be true, and it must be, if it leaves a sense that something's being hidden from them, that's counterproductive. Yeah.
So I think you've touched on one of the most important things when we look at Holocaust studies, as well as anything that might be related to trauma, is we look at transgenerational or intergenerational trauma. And one of the things that we do as our work as psychologists is also that we train to work in the silences and the open spaces of what's not being said and what's not being brought into our sessions. And even with children, I think that one of the simplest things you can do is if they come to you with a question, you can go something like, it sounds like you're wondering about that. What do you know about that? Ask them for the information that they do have and what they do know about it. And it's not only relating to Holocaust studies or what's happening in Israel, but I very often work with children, or I work with parents who say, oh, we never fight in front of my child, or, the Bobo or the Zaid is a Holocaust survivor and they don't want the child to learn about it. They don't want to know stories about it. But remember, children also have fantasies, and children make up things in their imagination and they fill in the gaps of what's not being said to them. And sometimes those fantasies are a lot scarier than the actual truth. So I agree with you, that having the conversation, it's not necessarily going to be an easy one, but it's a necessary one. And one of the things that I just wanted to mention was, I did a talk during, I think it was in the middle of our mini lockdowns that we had. And one of the messages that I like to share with parents is that the reason why books are so necessary and so important is because our imagination is never in lockdown. Our imagination can never be taken by anybody else. We have control over what we can imagine and what we can create, and the stories that we can imagine, the stories of hope, the stories of trying to understand. Our role as parents is really to help our children make sense of the world. And how do we do that? We do that by explaining. We do that by exposing them to things and not hiding away from the pain and the suffering. They are going to see that in their lives, as painful as it is to acknowledge that and to think about that, because we want to save our children from suffering. We don't want to see them upset. We don't want to see them struggling with anything, but for sure they're going to find things in their lives that will visit them, that will be painful. And the best we can do is to equip them with the life skills not to become completely incapacitated by that, but to actually embrace it and to try and make sense of it, to process it, to do it by talking to other people or to getting professional help, whatever it is. But reading is certainly a necessary component to help children understand it and to use their imaginations to try and to engage in those problem-solving skills, because we do want to have more generations of critical thinkers, don't we?
Thank you, all three of you. It was very beautifully expressed. And in a moment, I would like to take questions for the panelists from the audience as well. But before we do that, I'd actually like to ask if the three of you might give any insight into mistakes that we should not make. What would be some of the sorts of things that one as a parent might be inclined to do, but that you would not recommend?
I always think about a situation that a friend conveyed to me about a group of students at a Jewish day school. And it was Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and they wanted to do something with the year threes about the Holocaust. And so they had an expert come in to talk about Anne Frank, and it was question time. And the first student put up their hand, and they asked, what did Anne write with? And the person said, oh, a pen or a pencil. And then the next hand went up, and how did Anne sharpen her pencil? And then the next question went, and what if she made a mistake? Did she have an eraser? And all the hands were up in the group of students. And the teacher said, students, we've got so many questions here. We've had enough questions about the pencil. If you've got a question about the pencil, put your hands down so we can answer all the other questions. And all the hands went down. So I think, what's the mistake? The mistake is that even though we need to talk, how we talk about the Holocaust is really important. And students having context and understanding if it's something that's so far beyond their lived experience, we've got to be careful about that. And that is why we look at these individual stories, taking them through in the hidden exhibition so that they can really relate to that individual person. Like, look, there's a photo of Henry on his first day of school, and he's got his zucker taught, and have you got a photo from your first day of school? And look at the family picnics and all the things. So they're creating those links with those stories so that it doesn't become, what does it mean to be locked away with only one thing to write with, and what were they writing with, because that was their lived experience. So how the story is told has to be crafted in a way that Australian kids who have no experience in their cloistered lives, so that they can begin to get an understanding of what was going on. So that would be something the storytelling has to be top-notch.
Thank you.
I'll just add another little perspective on that, because all of us who have kids in our lives, particularly if we love them, they will say things that make us smile. And that's a beautiful part of adults sharing their lives with kids. But sometimes it's worth not making the smile your only response. Sometimes it's worth just having a bit more of a think about what they've said. For example, years ago I got a letter soon after Once was published, and it was a fan letter from a young reader. And he said, I've read Once several times. Thanks. I've read Once several times, and I love Felix, and I can see the picture I can see the story in my imagination. He said, but if ever anybody wants to make a movie of Once, could you just tell them that I would love to play Felix. I know him, I feel for him, and I would love to play him. And that boy's first name was Muhammad, and his second name showed that he definitely came from an Islamic community. Now, when I read his name before I read his letter, it made me smile, but then it made me feel lots of other things as well, and think about that simple little. It could so easily be dismissed as naivety, but it's something much more than that as well.
I was just going to say,
mine's off. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we make as parents is fear. Am I going to damage my child? Am I going to break my child? Will I tell them too much? Will I scare them? Will I scar them for life? And the reality is that conversations around death and conversations around sex, they're never going to be easy with kids. They're going to evoke all sorts of feelings in us. They make us feel weird. We don't really know how to approach them. But those are parts of life that your kids are going to come across. We have to give them the life skills. We need to know that they have to be what I call active participants in their life, not just sitting there and their life passes them by. They've got to grab onto it, grab onto the opportunities, have a thirst and a hunger for knowledge, and be curious about the world. And even if we don't have the answers, we know that kids sometimes stump us with questions. It's absolutely okay to say, you know what, that's a great question. Can I think about it? Can I let you know? Can I come back to you with that? Or what do you know about it? Or let's think about that together. What made you think about that? Where did you hear that? So not being afraid of the silences, not being afraid of not having all the answers. Go to the library. Let's see if we can find a book about this. Let's go to the Holocaust Centre. Let's find Simon and Morris, and let's talk to Lisa and to everybody else, and let's see if we can find a book about this and learn more about it. So really coming from a place of curiosity and wanting them to, or helping support them in learning more about what's happening around them. It's really hard because I think it's quite a fine line between what do we share and how much do we share and how much detail do we go into. But the key thing is really just, again, to be able to teach them the life skill, and that life isn't always going to be beautiful and comfortable, but the message is that we can go through this together, we can think about it together, you can hold and you can contain some of the difficulties that they have.
This is very beautiful advice, and I feel like what you are, each of you saying is inspiring more questions from me, but I'm also mindful of the fact that it's no doubt inspiring questions of people in the audience as well. So I might at this point actually ask if there is anybody here who has a question for any of the three panelists or a question for the panelists in general at this point.
Thank you, all the speakers, very informative. I'm on Facebook and watching every bit of news I can watch about what's going on now. You know, the message never again is now, and really things have changed. I would like to know more about how do you talk about hostages. You know, I've listened to your advice, make it sound as safe as possible and all of that, but some of the things that we are confronted with, we don't know how to handle ourselves, let alone how to talk to kids about it. And kids are seeing it, you know, those posters of the hostages of the children.
Is that to me? I'm assuming that's to me. Okay.
I feel totally unqualified to answer that question, so it's for you.
I'm tempted to say I feel totally unqualified to answer that question too. To be quite honest with you, I don't know. In all the years that I've done training, and I mentioned South Africa earlier on, inadvertently, all my training that I've ever done, my studies and my lived experience in South Africa, I don't know if there is a simple way to do that. I don't know if we actually have the words to put it to children or to adults in a way that makes sense. Because if I had to ask now, how many of you feel like you understand and can make sense of what's going on from the pictures that you see? Is there anyone in this room who could put up their hand? I definitely couldn't. And this is the work that I do every single day with children, with adults, with people who've studied it, with people who've trained in the army, with people who've trained in security. I don't think there's a single person, and certainly not Jewish people, who can adequately make sense of what is going on to actually comprehend it. I suppose my first question would be, where's this coming from? Is it because you have a child who's saying, "Mummy, what's a hostage?" or who's been kidnapped? And it's a double, because we want to create an awareness and we want to stand in solidarity and we want to hold space for every single person who's been taken hostage. But the flip side of that is that we'll end up having to explain this to other people. I don't know. That's the simple answer. I would think that it's probably just to use simple language and say, sometimes when countries are at war, sometimes they make bad choices. So they might take other people into where they're living, and they keep them there until they get what they want, until their needs are met. For little kids, it's really hard. I'm sorry, I don't have a simple way to explain it. My wish would be that we don't have to explain it, and that's why I say it's fine for the kids to know that there's a war going on. It's fine for them to understand that there's bad things happening. I'm not sure that it's helpful in any way for them to know all the details. There's certainly a lot of things coming out in posters and pictures and images. My gut feel and my advice is to not have them exposed to it, so that you don't have to try and explain it, because there literally are no words to explain what we are seeing. But if I had to try and be a little bit helpful, it would be something along the lines of, sometimes when there's war, sometimes the soldiers or people from the other side, they take things that don't belong to them and they keep them for a little while, maybe to make other people feel bad or to punish them. That's probably the simplest thing. That's probably the simplest way that I would explain it to them. I don't know. I wish I had better words to help you, so I don't know if that was helpful at all.
Shalya, would it, and I'm asking you because I defer to your experience, but I guess I'm thinking now back decades to when my own kids were very young, and I think something that I would be inclined to throw in, just in case, is what we adults would think is the obvious, which is, yes, the news is full of it, people are talking about it, it suddenly seems as if our world is full of hostages and kidnapping. It is actually not happening, thankfully, in our community. Our family, our friends, our community are not suddenly more exposed to those possibilities here in Australia because the media is full of it. Because it's a very natural thing for younger kids to think it's on the news. Even the distinction between Israel and Australia can blur easily when it's headlines and adults are looking stricken.
Yeah, I think you make a good point in that we do need to, as I said before, we do need to draw on the positive side. We do need to reinstate that sense of safety so that we aren't completely traumatized by it. So yes, pointing out, this was a question that I had with somebody at CSG recently, where they said to me, we were talking about doing some talks, and I said it's important for parents, as confronting as it might be to see armed guards standing outside the shuls or the schools, it's just as important to say to your children, oh, you see, that person's a protector and they're standing there to watch over you. They're watching what's going on. So, yeah, I do think it's important to help children understand that it's not happening on the same level as in Israel. I don't know if we could say with any certainty that we don't have the risk here, because I think we do, but that's not helpful to tell children that. So I think I would be erring on the side of caution and saying things like, you know what, sometimes bad things happen in the world and sometimes people don't make good choices, but we do have Dad and I, or Mum and I, or we have our family and we're looking after each other, and your teachers are protecting you, and we have people standing outside the school protecting us. So drawing on all of those different elements and trying to bring it down to a level that feels a bit more manageable to them. We can never give any sense of any guarantee that it's not happening, because the reality is it actually is. We do have some level of risk wherever we go as Jewish people in the world, but we don't want to incapacitate them with that fear. So yeah, it's a really good point to draw on that.
Thank you very much for your candour in responding to that question. Thank you very much for a very difficult question to respond to. I see some other hands that are up in the audience. I'll ask if, Dave, if you want to come to another questioner.
Hi, I'm a first-generation Australian and also have taught Holocaust studies at a Jewish school for many years. I came from your very normal Melbourne Jewish Scopus girl upbringing, and I had a very Jewish-centric view of genocide, and I just wanted to hear when you think it's appropriate to start discussing that genocide has not just happened to Jews, but has happened to lots of people in lots of different ways. When do you start that conversation?
Well, it's certainly something we talk about all the time as part of our senior school program. The way the hidden exhibition, which is specifically targeting level 10, we're not having broader conversations, but when we're looking, it's not an exhibition where we're focusing on those other conversations about genocide and so on, but certainly with our senior program from level 8 onwards, we would be talking about other genocides, and we do.
I would say that most of what we've said tonight about ways of talking to young people about the Holocaust hold true, really, for its I know it's a highly charged area, because while all of us would probably agree that comparative genocide is not really a particularly useful train of thought outside of perhaps certain academic areas, it's also very difficult, because neither do we want a sense that genocide is an homogenous thing, and I don't really have answers to that, but my sense has always been that a basic common sense that young people have would say, well, I've never heard a young person who's read once, or who I've had encounters with in a Jewish museum or Holocaust centre, ever say, why was it only the Jews who were ever subjected to such terrible human behaviour? Because I think there is an assumption that, having discovered that our species, some of us, are capable of such terrible things, there is an assumption that there is no kind of boundary set, that it only happens to certain people. But, you know, but neither, of course, unless the conversations are available to young people, do they really have support in those speculations or those half-formed assumptions. It's not an easy area, absolutely, but I think, for good reason, we've been focusing on the Holocaust tonight. But I think a lot of the ideas and a lot of the approaches hold true to the extent that there are universal truths about such behaviours.
Thank you, Morris. Thank you for that question. We may have time for one or possibly two more questions.
Thank you. Quite a specific sort of question. What I have debates with some of my colleagues on this topic, which is about content and ages, about what material at what ages. So I note in the hidden exhibition, as you're highlighting, it obviously doesn't deal with the worst things that happened in the Holocaust, and it takes a path there. So I'm particularly interested at, you know, when do you say 6 million Jews were killed? Do you say it at grade 2? Do you say it at grade 5? Do you say it in year 7? When all these sorts of things, when is the content? I don't know if there's one answer for this, but content and age is I'm interested in.
Yeah, it's tricky, and we debate this all the time. You know, when is it age appropriate, the content? And I think it really depends on the group of students and the maturity of that group of students. And I know that sounds like I'm being really vague there, but it really is depends on who. I mean, in a classroom situation, it's very hard to have these universal guidelines that says we definitely can mention it at year 8, although that's what we tend to do in school situations. This is when we're going to start introducing this piece of content and so on. I think as far as our guidelines that we use here, that we feel that from level 5 to level 8, we do talk about 6 million. We talk about death. The hidden exhibition looks at loss. It looks at the fact that John's mother and sister were betrayed by the people smugglers, and they were sent to Drancy, and as a result they were murdered. We do talk about Paul's aunt, who didn't take the advice of the French police not to stay at home on the night of the roundups, or did stay at home on the night of the roundups, I should say, and they were also caught and were murdered at Auschwitz. We don't skirt away from the death, but it's not the focus of what we're talking about at the exhibition. And I think Morris has certainly given me the confidence to have those to talk about death with students from the young ages that we're working with at that age, because of the respect he has of his young audience and his understanding that they can actually deal with some of those concepts. But in regards to dealing with ghettos and camps, we would begin to have those conversations at level 8 and level 9. But we have groups that are coming in who really don't quite understand constructs and frameworks. And when we're dealing with 99% of students from non-Jewish schools, that sometimes that we don't even want to talk about what's going on in the camps. And when we talk about the camps, it's not so much on what the terrible things that were being done. What you want to be focusing on is how did people respond to those terrible conditions. So what are the glimmers of hope? And I think in education, we are always going to be focusing on the positive stories, partly because what we've learned this evening is that we don't want students to lose hope. We want them to still have their faith in the broader society and in our institutions and in the adults in their lives. So we don't want to be destroying that as part of their worldview. So I think we can talk about the ghettos, but not what was done to the Jewish people. How did people respond? And those beautiful examples of resistance that we can look at. And I think that's where the educational gold is. So I think if those topics are taken with a really clear purpose, why are you mentioning it? And those the teachers that I work with, we have a very clear focus on the messages that we want to be actually giving. So what is the message? Why would we be covering this content in the first place? So I think you have to be asking, what is the key question and what is the key messages we want the students to be taking away from specific content? And I think there are the guides that will allow you to decide what content you want to be putting in.
If I may just add, just very short. Again, I think the question I wouldn't be so concerned about using the word 6 million Jewish people, because it kind of delineates the magnitude of it. For me, what would be more concerning is children are watching really scary things out there anyway. If you think of the things that kids are watching on Netflix and on YouTube, I hear that even in the schools, year 4, 5, and 6, kids are watching pretty scary stuff out there. And it's not Holocaust movies, and I'm far more concerned about that. That I think if you are looking at using education, something like the movie Paperclips, which focuses exactly on that. Children could not conceptualize what does 6 million look like. And the school, which wasn't a Jewish school, it took place in America, in some tiny little county town, and they decided to collect paper clips to see what does 6 million look like. And that prompted conversations about exploring more about the Holocaust. What does a Jewish person look like? What did they do? So again, not going, as Lisa said, not going into the details of what happened in the concentration camps, but like I've told my children, they know about the Holocaust, they know about Anne Frank, starting conversations about, we're lighting Shabbat candles tonight. Do you know that there was a time when Jewish people couldn't light candles. They couldn't put the Chanukiah up in the window for everybody to see. So it's a very simple conversation like, what does that look like? You know, just thinking about ourselves and other people and what has happened to Jewish people in history and having the conversations without all the details, I think is absolutely fine. The question you need to ask yourself is, will the child become completely incapacitated and stuck in the story and the details that you're going to be sharing, and use that as a guideline?
Thank you. I knew when we started this evening that we were going to be leaving people with a lot of questions that they would like to have answered. I am very mindful of the time and very grateful for the time that you have shared with us. And we've touched, I think, on some really very provocative ideas that are going to be percolating in people's minds around those issues of honesty and around agency and resilience and really the universality of this story. And thank you again for your candid answers to my questions and to the questions from the audience. And I'm going to invite Aviva to come back up onto the stage.
Thank you. Got it. Great. Thank you. I just wanted to say, Shalya, when you spoke earlier about gratitude, I would like to express my gratitude. And I think everyone here, all of you, Morris, Lisa, Shalya, thank you so much for sharing your words of wisdom with us here, and to Simon for leading this incredibly important and insightful discussion. I'm sure you'll all agree with me that this is an incredibly timely conversation. As we've learnt here tonight, engaging with age-appropriate depictions of the Holocaust can be a helpful way to introduce children and young people to this difficult subject. I encourage you all to come back and to experience our youth-focused hidden exhibition. And you can book tickets online now, which is very exciting. On the subject of timely discussions, next Thursday evening we'll be hosting our annual Betty and Shmuel Rosenkranz oration with guest speaker Karel Frekapani. Karel will be addressing the issue of combating anti-Semitism in the digital age, having spent much of his career and time with UNESCO tackling issues of Holocaust remembrance and education. So there are limited seats available, and I hope to see you all here next week. Again, tickets are online. As custodians of the truth, the MHM is committed to honouring the lives of survivors and the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust. Within these walls, we house their stories. Under this roof, we raise their voices. And when you leave, we ask that you carry their memory forward. Thank you once again to our panel, and importantly to you, our audience, for attending tonight's session. Good night.